All right, everyone. I think we're just going to go ahead and get started and let if anybody else who joins us join in a little bit later. So just a quick introduction. My name is Vanessa. I am the Executive Director at the Fond du Lac County Historical Society. So I'm really grateful you guys could join us today. We're going to have a little bit of fun talking about quilts and get into a little bit of the history behind them, as well as why they're great for sharing stories. So how many of you have a quilt at home? Raise hands. Quite a few. Awesome. Now, what is a quilt? How is it different from a blanket? Go ahead. Oh, I don't have audio on you guys. Let me see if I can mute you there. Okay, I think I can hear you guys.
Prettier than a quilt.
Prettier than a blanket.
Prettier than a blanket.
Prettier than a blanket. Good answer.
Can I hand you something?
Yes.
More than one layer?
Yes, exactly. A quilt, opposed to a blanket, has 2 layers of fabric with some stuffing or a filler in between to help make it a little bit heavier. And both sides can have design, or it can be just one side is plain and then the top side has design on it. But it's basically like a sandwich of fabric. And you can use the sewing of connecting those pieces of fabric to add extra design to it. Now, I'm going to see if I can share my screen here with you guys. And all right, can you see the PowerPoint? Great, awesome. We'll try to get that started here. There we are. All right, so now that we talked a little bit about what a quilt is, let's talk a little bit about what they're used for. So quilts can be art, and they can also be a practical garment. Because of course, if you need something to wrap you up and keep warm, that's a practical item. But like you mentioned before, quilts can be really pretty and can tell stories too. So they serve a lot of purposes. All right, so with the history of quilting, archaeologists believe that quilts started to become popular around the 1200s. So that's a very long time ago for quilts to be around. Now they started out just like a utility, like a blanket, but just a little extra warmth because, of course, if you're out in a cold winter, you want to make sure that you're staying warm. And then it really evolved over the years as it was in Europe and all sorts of other places. But we'll focus a little bit on American quilting. So the first style of American quilting was during the American Revolution and during the early colonial days. And so those types of quilt would be called whole cloth. Now, those kind of quilts weren't the prettiest quilts out there. The reason they were called whole cloth was that when they were importing fabric, because most people didn't make fabric here in the US at that time, the fabric came in short bolts. So they weren't long enough that they would cover your bed. So how do you make sure that the fabric is wide enough to cover your bed? Well, you take the couple bolts of fabric and you sew them together, and you'd use the same fabric for the entire quilt, and you'd use that until it was large enough to cover your bed. Kind of a practical thought with that, and it was a great way to use up your fabric. Then during the Civil War and prior to that, when people were advocating for abolition, it was used as a way to raise money. Now today we have the county fair, and you might know with 4-H and other organizations, they have competitions for raising animals, for making arts and crafts. Well, quilts were a very popular item to put into a competition. And so the best of these quilts would be sold at auction. And so this would be a way for people to raise money for the abolition of slavery. And of course, during the Civil War, it was a practical piece of equipment for a soldier to have. Because if you're sleeping out in a tent all night, you're going to get kind of chilly. So they had these quilts made so that the soldiers would stay warm. So you might see it's poking out here underneath our little screen here showing everybody's faces, but there is a quilt on the side, and you can notice it's a narrow quilt. It's not a very wide quilt, it's very narrow. And the reason for that is that cots were made very narrow at that time, and they had to make a quilt small enough to fit on your cot. So families would often take older quilts they owned and then cut them into thirds, which would allow that quilt to fit in the space of that cot. So it also would extend it and make it go further because it could cover 3 people versus just 2. And then after the war, as people were settling out here in Fond du Lac and in other places around the US, it was a means for women to gather together. Because oftentimes you've probably heard of barn raisings where people would get together and build a barn. Well, quilting was an opportunity for people to get together too. So the women in a community would get together and help make a quilt, whether it was for a special occasion, like a wedding or for a birthday, or if they had someone new in town. And that was often a thing they would do as a gift to give them. And so it was a great way to bridge that community. They also had, at the end of the 1800s, crazy quilts. Now, what do you think a crazy quilt would look like? Multicolors and fancy. Well, in the center of the screen here, we have a crazy quilt. Oop, we'll go back. So you can see it's got some embroidery that's outside the lines. They got different stitches and different colored thread in different places. And so it's very unique. And you can notice the fabric. There's lots of different colors and types of fabric. Some is more cotton, some of it's more flannel, and lots of variants in the style of material that was used. And so these crazy quilts were a great way for people who made their own clothes at home or like to collect those kind of things. They could have small pieces of fabric and then combine them together into this larger piece of art. Now, storytelling is a big element of quilting. And some of the things you might notice in a quilt are pictures, what types of fabrics they are using, their design, and if they're personalized. You can see in this picture here of a lady who is making a quilt, and you can see that she is putting together these tiny little hexagons. So those are little pieces of fabric, and oftentimes you either have to hand sew those or you have to be really careful when you're stitching because they can be a little difficult. All right, so with this first quilt, this is a Hmong story quilt. Now the Hmong were from Laos, and Laos is in Southeast Asia, and a lot of them were displaced and became refugees during the Vietnam War. And one of the ways they tell their stories is through quilt art like this. Now, let's look at the top row of people. Who are the people up there? Do you see? What kinds of things are they carrying and what are they doing? Yeah, tap your button here so you can see. Unmute.
Say it again, guys.
Luggage.
They're carrying luggage, that's right. They're carrying things with them on their backs, and they're carrying it with them on their journey. And then what do you see in the next section here? With all the white lines, what do you think that might be?
Water.
Swimming across the river, that's right. There's a river that separates Laos and Thailand. And so a lot of those refugees had to cross the river to get to safety. Now, what do you see in the bottom row?
Soldiers. Soldiers.
That's right. When they came to the other side, they met with soldiers and they put them into camps for refugees. And so that was something that they experienced. And so this is how they documented it. So you can tell a story just by looking at a quilt. And there's lots of really great examples of this type of art here in Wisconsin as well, because a lot of the Hmong people did move here after the war. Now, how about this piece? Do you think there's any story in this one?
Yeah. Yeah.
What story do you think you'd see? And this is related to the fabric.
People, letters.
Is it Indian?
Hands.
This is Kenta fabric. Now, Kenta is from Ghana, which is in North Africa. And so this type of fabric was used as a way to tell who someone was. And so they would wear this clothing and this fabric. And this fabric is made in a really unique way. So they would weave a section of fabric and then weave in another section of fabric. So it's a very time-consuming process. And you can see all the little gold and red accents. All of that is hand-stitched in. So you can tell that there is a lot of love and a lot of interest that was put into this project. And you can see they've got different symbols that look like animals. And that's a big thing in Africa, they have that. And this was a great way to talk about someone's adventures. So what animals they've encountered, what adventures they've been on. And so it really could tell a story about who you were. You can see that there's blue and gray fabric in there, and there's threads in there. And so that would tell you what region they were from. So that person would be able to be identified by their fabric. And it can tell you about who they are, whether they're an important person or someone who is going through a special experience. And it really can tell a story about who the person is. The next one is design. So what do you see in this quilt here? What kinds of designs do you see?
Leaves.
Flowers.
Flowers.
Lots of branches on there too. Do you see at the end of each of the squares over here that there's little buds, like flowers that are about to bloom like in spring?
Yes.
So it tells like the circle of the seasons. So it talks about the spring. And you can tell by the design that it's a very geometric. Do you see the squares and how they're lined up perfectly on there? And so that would be kind of a difficult thing to do if you didn't have a ruler, right? To make sure all those pieces were right lined up. And this was made in the 1850s. So they probably didn't have rulers at home or a Cricut machine to make sure each piece was cut out just right. So they had to do a lot of work to design how they wanted the quilt to look. So they'd have to cut out the pieces in the way they wanted it to be. And they'd have to lay it out and arrange it and sew it on. And then of course, applique it in the way they wanted it to look. Now the next way here is personalization. So you can see on the left, there is a signature on the quilt. And you can see that it's done in red, and that is red thread. So a common practice was to collect signatures, whether it was from people in your family, people in your community, or celebrities, including President Lincoln. And once they signed your piece of fabric, you would take your thread and then you would copy stitch by stitch their signature. That's pretty difficult to forge a signature, much less to sew a signature. And so this was a great way to hang on to memories of someone that you were close with and how they shared their stories. you can see in the next quilt over here that there are all sorts of different kinds of blocks on the quilt. Now, some of them show places or people, and so it's made by a community. You can see here it says Stamford, and a common practice that people would do was to create a community quilt. So a different person in the community would take on a different quilt block. They would make it the way they like to make their quilts, and then they would combine all the blocks into one large quilt representing the community. And of course, you can see the date on there for the anniversary. All right, so another way of storytelling in quilts. This talks about, we'll talk a little bit about Harriet Powers. Now, Harriet Powers, she was born in Georgia in the 1830s, and she was born a slave. And after the Civil War, she and her husband got their own property and had their own farm, and she enjoyed quilt making. And you can see here with this quilt is an example of one that she made. And we have the story about what happened to this quilt. And she had made it and had brought it to the county fair in the 1860s or 1880s. And she had brought it in. And you can see, if you look closely at the quilt, that this is a Bible quilt. So each scene on the quilt is a different Bible story. And so this was something that was very unique, wasn't very utilitarian. It told a really good story. And so it had been noticed by a wealthy young lady in the community who was white, and she offered to buy it. And of course, this was a very important piece for Harriet. It was very difficult to make, so she wasn't willing to sell it. But later on, she and her husband ran into some financial troubles, and she did choose to sell it to this young woman. And this young woman, as she grew up, she passed down generation to generation, and now it's at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. You can tell that the story that Harriet wanted to tell still can be read today. If you look at the top left corner, you can see Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and you can see the different animals and the different stories that she's trying to tell through there. And so you can see that today we still are telling Harriet's story and seeing it the way she would have seen it. And you can see on the left hand, there's a photo of a couple making quilts back in the 1940s. Now, quilts today are often made with machines, but back then it had to be hand sewn, which is a lot of work and took a lot of time and extra hands to help get it done in a decent amount of time. And you can see there they have it set up on a quilt frame. So it's basically 4 pieces of wood, and so you'd stretch the quilt out over it, and then you have to do all the hand sewing to get it all sewn together. And so you can see it was a very detailed work, and so it was very important to make sure that you were working with a friend and not doing it by yourself, because it would be very time consuming. Right. Then we take a look at a quilt today. So comparing this quilt to one that we've already seen, is it really detailed? Is it lots of colors? You can see that it has all sorts of different shapes and sizes of quilt blocks. You see triangles big and small. And you can see that there is a kind of geometric shape going around into the outside in a diamond shape. Now that's made with machine sewing. And of course, it's a beautiful look, but it'd be very difficult to try to recreate by hand. And you can see that it's all monochromatic. So they're all shades of blue and black and tan. And they can all kind of go together that way. And so quilts can be of all sorts of varieties today. And they're often used as art versus something utilitarian that you would put on your bed. So wrapping up a little bit here, quilts and quilted fabrics have been keeping people warm for thousands of years. Quilts can tell the story of a person and the culture that created it. And storytelling can come through artwork. So like you had seen with the Hmong story quilts, as well as the Kenta Fabric, it's important that all cultures have been able to use fabric as a way to tell their stories and to pass them on to future generations. And you can see down in this photo here, it can be a family project to do quilting. And so it can be just for a special occasion, or it can be something to keep you on your bed. But either way, they're beautiful things to explore. Now, here we got some resources. I've posted some of these in the group chat. You can see there's a couple of YouTube videos here. I highly recommend both of them. The first one is about the Atlanta sewing community, and in Alabama, their sewing community, and talking about the importance of it to their culture. And there also is a story by Miss Ringwald, which is about how quilts influenced her artwork and her books. And there's a book out there called Tar Beach, and it is all based on a series of quilts that Miss Ringwald had made. And it tells a story about a young girl growing up in New York City and how her experiences were shaped by that. All right, guys, we're gonna get out of the screen share here. And do you have any other questions before we wrap things up about quilts?
They are sometimes big and small.
Yes, that is right. Some quilts are rather small. You can have some that fit on your table. And then you can have ones that are really big, big enough to cover a king-size bed. So they can be all sorts of shapes and sizes, colors as well. And great question, Kim. Are there any special quilts at the Galloway house or in the village? And there are. We have a special quilt on Edwin Pierce's bed in his bedroom. And that quilt is a story quilt from the city of Fond du Lac. And it has different quilt blocks made by local quilters that made different historic places. So there's a log cabin, there's one of their gristmill that started out, the first courthouse here in Fond du Lac County is on there. So there's lots of really interesting things with that.